I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network. Today I'm speaking with Remi Piet, who is Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. Thank you so much for joining me, Remi.
Hi, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So today we're going to have a look at the Guyanas. So the geography nerds amongst us will know that these are three territories on the north coast of South America. They don't speak Spanish or Portuguese there. So what can you tell me about these three territories, Remi? What makes them unique compared to the rest of the continent and the region?
Well, indeed, they are very unique in comparison with Latin America and the continent as a whole. First of all, they are Caribbean countries. They're part of CARICOM, so in terms of their international agreements, they do not follow the same, let's say, institutional structure as other countries in Latin America. More importantly, as you were mentioning, none of them have Spanish or Portuguese as their main language. British Guyana speaks English. Dutch Guyana, obviously, Suriname speaks Dutch, and the French Guyana remain as a region of France, obviously has French as a official language. They also, despite having those official languages, have a strong presence of indigenous communities and are considered to be very similar in terms of their geography and operational issues for miners, especially with a very large territory that is covered by Amazonian forest and very limited amount of infrastructure. Now, if the mining community would see it and call those jurisdictions as the Guyana Shield, they are very diverse from one another when you take it from a perspective of abound the ground risks and the series of policies and strategies that any mining company or investor should be very cautious about when implemented their community relations or their external affairs strategy. On the one hand, you have two countries, as I mentioned, that became independent. Guyana in 1966 from the British Commonwealth. The Suriname became independent in 1975. French Guyana stayed a region of France, so actually abide by the entire set of European Union regimes and standards and rules. So it's a very administratively marked and structured country and jurisdictions as opposed to Guyana and Suriname, which have a very much less complete sets of regulations and environmental regulations and laws in terms of mining and extractive industries. When you look at politics specifically, Guyana is one country that is marked by a very vibrant democracy and a series of instability there because of the uniqueness of the structure of its population. Half of the Guyanese population is Indo-Caribbean, the other half is Afro-Caribbean, if I'm kind of simplifying things, and they both usually vote for different parties that have strong antagonism between one another. And right now, when we'll talk about Guyana more in depth, we'll look at the uniqueness of the political situation right now. But also, the importance here is the discovery of very large oil reserves in Guyana that changed completely the structure of the future economy of the country. The second country, Dutch Guyana, Suriname, therefore, is actually ruled by a former dictator, Desiré Bouterse, who has under his name a series of Interpol warrants, has been placed on the sideline of globalization by the United States and a series of European countries, and therefore is very much more linked to Russia or China in terms of its own development, which makes it extremely, you have to be extremely cautious in terms of the way that the country runs its monetary policies and economic policies, but also the linkages and power relationships inside Suriname. And then finally, French Guyana, which is a very structured European territory, has strong potential in terms of extractive industries, but as we will look maybe more in detail, over the last 3 to 5 years, a series of mining projects have been placed on hold because of political, let's say, conflict between Paris and the region and local communities towards mining projects.
Okay, so how about we start with Guyana then? What does it look like in terms of stability politically?
So Guyana, as I was mentioning, half of the population is Indo-Caribbean, has been in power for several decades until fairly recently. This this community behind the PPP party of Jack Deo has been used to run the country, but has been marked by very strong development of corruption in Guyana. They lost the recent election 3 years ago against a coalition of Afro-Caribbean countries led by President David Granger. David Granger tried to with the support of the US and some of the very strong investors in Guyana, especially ExxonMobil, which I'll mention a little later, has tried to, let's say, clean a little bit the politics of Guyana, but obviously by cleaning, the corruption in that country that has limited the economic development in a very short run and created a certain amount of discontentment among the population. His majority in Congress was very limited and weak. Among the 65 congressmen, he only had a one-seat majority, and that seat actually disappeared when one of these representatives in Congress decided not to support the government anymore, putting the government right now in a lame duck situation and early elections to be officially organized before the end of this year. You're looking at a parliamentary member who apparently has accepted, there's allegation has accepted a bribe of $1 million in pure gold to be able to change allegiances to the opposition, and that example shows you the kind of politics and corruption that exists in Guyana, a country which is probably one of the least developed in the Western Hemisphere. But what's most interesting is that ExxonMobil has actually made 13 discoveries of oil since 2015 and is planning to produce 120,000 barrels of oil per day starting in 2020. That means that this country is going to go from underdevelopment to an extremely level of economic growth, which it has probably not foreseen, and its domestic institutions are not ready for such a change in terms of its economic development path. And that obviously triggers a lot of appetite, both on the political level and economic level, with the upcoming elections of who will be at the helm of the country and therefore deciding the type of regulations to be put in place.
So, when would it be producing 120,000 barrels of oil per day? I mean, how soon is that? Do you think?
So
What's the timeline?
So it is by 2020. That's the official target. That probably will be having a ramp up in terms of production of oil in Guyana. But clearly, in terms of in the energy circle, Guyana is the new, let's say, the new Qatar, the new country that actually, out of almost very limited development, will become a juggernaut in the energy. Let's say geopolitics, and which is very very interesting to look, especially because of the geographical situation of Guyana, bordering Venezuela, with a specific border conflict with Venezuela on the Essequibo region that actually hosts some of those oil resources. By 2020, 2021, we're going to see a political regime being able to reinvest very large amount of royalties and taxation from production of oil in the country, and therefore whoever will win the 2019, the end of the next election was supposed to be scheduled for 2020, but will be before the end of the year because of the current instability, is likely to be able to maintain power for a series of mandates, because it will have in its end and its coffers a huge amount of resources that has never happened in Guyana in recent history, and will be probably able to thanks to populistic decisions or favoritism, to make sure that his own supporters are actually at the helm of the key institutions in the country.
Okay, and I suppose finally, what about the development side of things? So where are the oil resources? Are they offshore, on land, or ExxonMobil going to have to plow a lot of their own money into developing the infrastructure?
So they're offshore in terms of infrastructure. Most of the infrastructure is looking like the entire refinery system would actually be taken care of by Trinidad and Tobago, but all those resources are offshore. What's interesting, however, is that in onshore you still have vast untapped natural resources possibilities, especially with gold production in Guyana. Until today, still gold production is the number one source of income of the country, before rice and before any other in the country. And there is also, for the mining community, there is a very strong potential in the country, with Guyana Goldfield being the largest company today, but a series of reserves and opportunities that are almost not developed today with foreign investors, simply because there's a lack of knowledge of the type of regulation, how to operate in such a jurisdictions, with a series of also issues at the local level, There's the case of the Marudi Mountain, for example, where Guyana Gold Strike operates and is facing a series of issues with illegal and miners around the mining site. That's issues that actually can be seen across the Guyana, where you have strong immigration from Brazil with the garimpeiros, with the locals also harvesting reserves without having the right to do so.
Okay, and so speaking of illegal miners, this is a good opportunity to jump across to Suriname. So at the start of August, there were reports that an illegal miner was on the site of IAMGOLD's Rosabelle gold mine, and there was an incident between the illegal miner and police, and according to reports, the miner was shot. So what can you tell me about the illegal mining situation in Suriname, and what does this mean for the operators there? So obviously I've just mentioned IAMGOLD, they're a major Canadian gold miner.
Yeah, I mean, illegal mining is a risk that miners across across the world have much more worries to tackle, because it's actually been increasing in all jurisdictions around the world. Obviously, the price of gold is probably a main factor for this. There's also history of informal miners in those jurisdictions with different types of claims in those jurisdictions on some of the reserves. In the case of Guyana, those informal miners exist. In Suriname, they're very much present, and same thing also in French Guyana in the south of the jurisdiction, especially with the immigration from Brazil, as I was mentioning. Suriname is very specific in the sense that, as opposed to Guyana and French Guyana, you do have strong, large companies that operate in Suriname. In Guyana, you mainly have junior miners from Canada. In Suriname, you have IAMGOLD, and you also have Newmont that has a large project, with the Million project being very close to production by today. So you have already structures and mines that have been operating at a very large level. The Rosabelle mine for IAMGOLD is an example of a very strong and producing project with it's looking like you're going to have expansion of that project with other neighboring findings. But at the same time, while in some jurisdictions you were encouraged to have a very strong security protocol to limit the arrival of informal miners and legal miners, in a country like Suriname, where the president himself is known to have his own mining interests, where he has a series of his, let's say, close allies that have been well known to be informal miners and tapping into existing, projects, and sometimes they just have just a phone call away from the president to then pressure the mining company to make sure that they can still continue operate instead of the fact that they do not have the legal right to exploit some of those reserves. This is a situation that you have to be cautious about when you operate in Suriname or when you operate in Guyana. In the case of IAMGOLD, I know we've been operating on the ground in Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana for several years now, so we know very well the situation in those jurisdictions. Clearly, we've seen that IAMGOLD taking stronger measures in terms of their security protocol, while in the past they had been a little bit more lenient in terms of probably not enforcing them too strongly when the informal miner or the small miner would actually have close ties with the president himself. And so this is a situation that where if you don't implement structure and define clearly from the get-go some clear guidelines in terms of how to operate with informal miners, then you actually eventually arrive to a situation that just happened to IAMGOLD early August with the death of an informal miner, which resounded in international press and led with a series of discontentment across, around the mine in the immediate vicinity from communities that now have become antagonistic to the Rosabelle project.
Okay, and so from what we know, the company has had to cut back on its guidances, and it's dismissed over 300 contractors. So so you've just mentioned antagonistic community. So what sort of consequences further from what has already happened could come about for IAMGOLD?
Well, the issue that you have in Suriname, and again, Suriname is distinct from Guyana or French Guyana. Each logic here in terms of the perception of mining is very different from one jurisdiction to the next. But yes, there has been historical mining in those jurisdictions, so you don't have this idea that miners are usually a neo-colonialism like you would have probably in some remote areas of Peru, Ecuador, and so on. In Suriname, it has been seen across the board the population and the political parties are in favor of mining. However, the issue that you have is the level to which the royalties and local development of mining operations do favor local communities, and whether or not the local communities that were used to be, let's say, mining on the side, or some of them having like illegal or informal mining activity close to the mining site, were either managed or were really tackled with clear guidelines. When you don't have those clear guidelines, therefore, you then arrive to some issues such as the unfortunate death of one of those illegal miners early August, and you create a situation of conflict with the local community. So there's no clear history of how informal miners or illegal miners were operating close to some of those projects. That's the case of the Maradi projects, for example, in Guyana. In the case of Rosabelle, it's a little bit more complex, but you have to be very clear to ensure that you have a clear communication together with the local government, and that actually implement to every single type of illegal or informal miners, meaning that you don't have a special treatment from those that might have more political leverage with people at the helm of the country. And that's what's happening in Suriname. So it's very important for any mining company to, when operating in Guyana, to first have clear security guidelines and strategies in terms of mitigating the security risks, but also as across every single jurisdiction in Latin America and probably globally, to really make the case of the local development and creation of value around the mining site. So when you have one of those conflicts that erupt, you do have the capacity to oppose to the ongoing discourse the fact that the mining project has helped local communities develop and foster strong alternative economic activity next to the mining site. I've been to Rosabelle myself, several times. I know Suriname very well, and Guyana and French Guyana, obviously being French myself. And you're seeing that there's probably a lack of clear strategy in terms of CSR, community management around those mining sites because of the lack of strong demands from governments to have modern socialized projects in the Guyana Shield today.
Okay, and so speaking of structure, let's just have a quick look at Suriname's leader. So you've mentioned that he was a former dictator, and he's been president for almost a decade now in his own right, an elected president.
Well, Desiree Guterres is a very charismatic gentleman. He's known in history, obviously, for being a dictator in 1980. He was actually charged with murders of a series of his opponents in the 1980s, and was able to have the trial being more or less dismissed, if I can put it this way, because the main witness of the crime has decided to commit suicide the night before testifying. So that gives you an idea of the situation in Suriname. It's a very unique jurisdiction in terms of its politics and in terms of how politics operate and elections are run in the country. However, the position of Desiree Guterres, it's a gentleman that you can actually, if you approach him with a clear project for a mining operation, such as Newmont did, or IAMGOLD did, and other projects in Suriname, you can actually have a clear view of how to develop and engage with institutional relationship and mitigate political risks. The issue that you have, especially with Suriname, unfortunately, is the economic situation, as the country decided to move away from the IMF 2 or 3 years ago, if I'm not wrong, decided not to operate in terms of implementing the series of structural reforms in the macroeconomic sphere. What Guterres has done is that he has turned his position closer to Russia, closer to funds from the Middle East. Also, Sergei Lavrov was actually in Suriname earlier this month, and you have a clear bond that is being created between China, Russia, and Suriname, and some of the Islamic funds from the Emirates specifically, as opposed to the U.S. that has really left Suriname on the side of the road with a series of warrants and sanctions against the country. So when you actually operate in Suriname, you have to be well aware of this. You have to be very cautious in terms of knowing who your financial partners will be. And also, as I said, it's also the actors and partners that you will have on the ground in terms of how they are linked to the president, a president that is now, since he was dictator in the 1980s, is arriving, if I'm honest, in his early 70s, is not going to be in power for several decades more. And so you're looking at a possible democratic transition that will happen 2 or 3 years from now in Suriname, in a situation very interesting to look at from a geopolitical angle.
Certainly, and certainly looking at politics, let's now move on to French Guiana. So on paper, from what you've just described of Suriname, French Guiana could not be more different. I mean, it is an overseas department and a region of France. It's part of the European Union, so it's very, very structured and very, very bureaucratic. What can you tell me about French Guiana?
Well, French Guiana is fascinating jurisdiction when you look at it. It's a mix of an Amazonian territory with the same, operational issues that you would have with running a mining project in such a hostile environment. It has a shortage of infrastructure when you actually move away from the main urban centers and the coastline. So you have, good infrastructure in Cayenne. You have somewhat good infrastructure close to Saint Laurent du Maroni and the frontier with Suriname. But then the 90% of the territory is virgin Amazonian forest, which unfortunately is being plagued by illegal mining from garimpeiros from northern Brazil and from different also criminal organizations that actually do not abide by a series of environmental regulation when they try to dig for gold. There's a strong potential for gold in French Guyana, and a series of projects were being developed by different companies. IM Gold was the first large company trying to operate in French Guyana, but decided in its project Camp Caïman was very close to a natural reserve, and eventually they never were able to receive the environmental licensing that they were hoping to get to be able to develop the project. They're still present now in French Guyana, but not producing. You have Columbus Gold together with Norgold, so it's a Russian/Canadian project that had pushed forward with a very strong project called Montagne d'Or, which was at the frontier with Suriname, a strong potential in terms of reserves, and was actually, interestingly enough, backed by President Macron before he got elected in Paris. But these project right now is being stalled for a series of different reasons. The first one is probably a lack of skills from the managerial team of Columbus Gold and Montagne d'Or to actually socialize the project and explain to the communities and especially to, let's say, the mid-level class and entrepreneurial class in French Guyana that they would actually benefit from such a project with a series of indirect jobs being created, and also a certain arrogance when dealing with the indigenous communities. And that has created, unfortunately, with a series of errors during the communication campaign that was very top-down campaign, there is creating a certain antagonism among communities. On the second level, in Paris, you had a switch from Macron towards more environmentally friendly, and let's say, especially in terms of some key decision to try to attract more support from the Green Party ahead of the European elections. You had a switch from the Macron administration to move a bit away from this project, and this project is right now being, probably on hold until 2022 in the next election. That doesn't mean, however, there's no potential for mining in French Guyana. We know of several projects that actually are moving forward in French Guyana. And there are projects that are well run because they run from a bottom-up approach that actually work with the local key economic and political power in French Guyana, that actually understand how mining and sustainable mining is actually much better for French Guyana, regularized and formal mining, rather than to have informal miners operate on where the resources are, and are able to incrementally move forward some of their projects. We're eagerly waiting for the reform of the mining code that should actually happen before the end of the year. But there are strong potential in French Guyana, a territory that is marked by strong regulation, obviously European regulation, but also that has its pros and cons, meaning that you actually know how to operate and you don't have the same kind of issues with the level of corruption or the level of political interference that you might have in Suriname and British Guyana. In French Guyana, the rules are much more stricter, and therefore that allows you to be able to have more security and certainty in the way that you operate your business if you are being able to socialize it and to actually develop it on an incremental basis, gathering the support locally from key players.
Perfect, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to go through these three very different countries, Remi.
It's my pleasure, Scott. I've been a little long on those answers, but there's so much to be said about those jurisdictions.
And that was Remi Piet, Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network. You can find us at investingnews.com and feel free to follow us at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.